So in the last video, we talked about the origins of what we as scholars will call Hinduism. And we talked about how really it's a fusion of the Indus Valley civilization, what we might think of as the indigenous civilization at the time of 2750 to 1750 BCE, and the Indo-Europeans who, again, according to the dominant theory, might have arrived on the Indian subcontinent around 2000 BCE, allowing for a bit of overlap. And we said that once that fusion really occurs and the Indus Valley civilization has died out, then we will see the origins of what we will finally call Hinduism. And we see this primarily with what are called the Vedas. So this video is all going to be about the Vedas, which are always defined as the earliest sacred teachings within Hinduism. That's the way we think of the Vedas, as the earliest sacred teachings or the earliest sacred compositions within the religion that we will call Hinduism. Now, the word Veda itself actually means knowledge. So clearly what's being suggested here is that these teachings possess knowledge. These teachings are the source of knowledge about ourselves, about the world around us, and about how everything works in our reality. So this is why these texts, which will eventually be texts, at this point are more oral compositions and teachings, will be seen as technically the most authoritative teachings within all of Hinduism. Right? Now, the teachings are generally composed over a fairly long period of time. The earliest teachings that are going to make up part of the Vedas will appear around 1500 BCE, maybe a little bit earlier, depending on which scholar you're reading. And the latest of the Vedic teachings will appear closer to around 600 BCE. Again, maybe a little bit later, depending on the source that you're consulting. So we have about a 900-year time span of Vedic teachings being composed. Vedic is simply the adjective term for the Vedas, just like we would talk about in Christianity, for example, the Bible, but then we would use the term biblical to use as an adjective, biblical figures, biblical literature. Here it is the Vedas and Vedic ideas or Vedic teachings. So the Vedas are being composed for a period of about 900 years. It's actually fairly similar to what we see in biblical Judaism at about the same time in history, obviously in a different portion of the world at that time of history. Obviously, when you look at something like the Christian New Testament, everything there is being composed within, I don't know, maybe 50 or 60 years. Here, everything is being composed over a span of 900 years, very similar to what you find in the Hebrew Bible, with the earlier so-called books of Moses being composed maybe in the 12th, 11th, 10th centuries BCE, and perhaps some of the prophets and writings extending, perhaps some of the writings, even to around 200 BCE, during the time of the Maccabees. So again, roughly a 900 or so year time span. Now, the Vedas are composed by individuals who are given the title of Rishi. A Rishi is simply a seer. That is usually the English translation of the term rishis. Now, some of you might have heard a term like that before, actually close to where I live here in Iowa. In Fairfield, Iowa, we have the Maharishi University, named after a man who was called the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. Now, we will see later on that Maha is a term that means great. We will see that, for example, with the Mahabharata. We think of it even with the title given to Gandhi, Mahatma, the great soul. So here we had the Maharishi in Iowa in the 20th century, and that means that he was actually referring to himself, and others were referring to him not only as a rishi, not only as a seer, just like those who composed the teachings of the Vedas way back when, but also as the great seer, the Maharishi, right? It's a title that is very rarely used other than when referring to the original composers of the Vedic literature. And yet here, this figure in the 20th century was giving himself that title and referring to himself as the great seer. So that clearly shows something about the origin or the believed origin of the Vedas. To say that the so-called authors or composers of the Vedic teachings were seers suggests almost that the ideas that they then compose and teach in their teachings are actually not originating within their own minds, but instead they saw these ideas. These ideas came to them somehow, and they were simply the vehicles for making these ideas, the knowledge of the Vedas, known to humanity. You also get this sense of the origin of the Vedas being very special with this other term that I have typed up on the screen here, the term Shruti. I always try to keep the number of non-English terms to a minimum, but some of these terms are so important that we have to get familiar with them. So the rishis are the composers of the Vedas, the seers, having these ideas come to them, perhaps through visions that they saw, something like that. And then this term Shruti, which is generally translated as that which is heard, H-E-A-R-D, like with your ears, that which is heard. Again, what this signifies is a non-human origin to the teachings of the Vedas. Right? Now, I don't want to right away jump to a conclusion that the rishis heard the ideas of the Vedas from a divine source, for example. We don't want to necessarily assume some sort of divine revelation like we might have with the religion of Islam, where God is speaking through the angel Gabriel directly to the Prophet Muhammad, giving him the words of the Quran, or even a kind of divine inspiration that we might think of within Judaism or Christianity. Some Hindus certainly do believe in a kind of direct divine revelation of the Vedic ideas to the rishis. But generally speaking, most Hindu scholars will simply assume here a non-human origin to the Vedas. And they won't really go into a lot of more detail in describing exactly what that means, exactly how these ideas came to the rishis. Did they see these ideas, which is suggested by the title rishis? Did they hear these ideas, which is suggested by Shruti as the way that we talk about the Vedic literature? We're not really sure, but what is suggested clearly is that these ideas did not originate in the minds of those human rishis. Right? And this is important because what do we know about most human minds? Well, most human minds clearly seem to be fallible. That is, you and I can say things that might not necessarily be true. We might be mistaken. We might be confused. But if the ideas of the Vedas came from a non-human origin, if they did not originate within the minds of the fallible human rishis, this allows them to be seen as infallible, as perfect knowledge, right? As the truth. So by referring to the composers as the rishis, you're already getting that suggestion, but then by classifying the Vedas as Shruti, they are Shruti, they are that which is heard, you're clearly signifying a non-human origin. That's always the key phrase when thinking about Shruti and what that means for the Vedas. As we will see in future videos, traditionally only the Vedas are classified as Shruti. There will be many other very important texts to Hindus throughout history, and yet they are generally not classified as Shruti. Only the Vedas are Shruti. There will be a lesser classification for all non-Vedic sacred texts within Hinduism. Okay. Now, saying a little bit more about the Vedas here, eventually when the entirety of the Vedas has been made known, you will see the various Vedic teachings be compiled first through oral transmission from generation to generation. Obviously, there are different rishis every generation, and they are coming forth with teachings. People within a particular community see those teachings as authoritative, as Vedic, therefore they are remembered and passed down to future generations. Eventually what we see is a compilation of those teachings by different communities, and that's going to end up resulting in 4 big collections of the Vedas. Right? So if you go to a university library or if you go to Amazon, you can probably purchase or find the 4 Vedic collections, right? We often think of the Rig Veda, oftentimes transliterated as R-I-G or even just R-G, the Rig Veda. We often think of the Rig Veda first because we believe that it might have been the first written collection of the Vedas and therefore perhaps the most authoritative of the 4 collections. But there is a lot of overlap between the Vedic collections. One way to think about it is to think of there just being different communities who are all remembering these Vedic ideas. And if you're transmitting these teachings orally, you're obviously going to have slight variations in the way they are remembered. Think of being in elementary school, maybe you played the game telephone where somebody in the front of the classroom whispered something to the first student, and then it went all the way through the room, and by the end, it wasn't the same as what was whispered at the beginning. So when you use oral transmission, there's always the possibility for some variation. Plus, some individuals in certain communities might be seen as rishis, and their teachings might be remembered by those communities, even though they are not seen as rishis in other communities. So you will have some unique portions of each Vedic collection that is not found in the others. But generally speaking, much of the Vedic collections are the same, especially in the early sections. But you have 4 big Vedic collections. We don't need to worry about the names of all of those, but 4 big Vedic collections. The Rig Veda is the most well known. And then within each of the 4 big Vedic collections, you are going to find 4 sections. Right? So in contemporary publishing of the Vedas, if there's a table of contents page, no matter which of the 4 collections you are looking at, you will see the Vedas broken down into the same 4 sections. Each of the Vedas will begin with the hymns, be followed by the ritual treatises. I'm not going to worry about the Sanskrit for those 2 sections because we don't hear the Sanskrit of those sections quite as frequently as the other 2. But then when you get to the 3rd and 4th, we hear the Sanskrit much more frequently, so I want us to be familiar with the Sanskrit term as well as the English translation. So the 3rd section of each of the Vedic collections is the Aranyakas, generally translated as the compositions of the forest. And in the final section, which is going to have the most kind of variation between the Vedic collections, is going to be called the Upanishads, which is generally translated as sitting near the teacher. Right? So let's say a little bit about each of these sections to try to get a sense of what's going on in this most authoritative group of teachings within Hinduism, right? That really mark the beginnings and the early formation of the Hindu religion. So the hymns and the ritual treatises generally work together, and these sections are organized chronologically, which means the hymns and the ritual treatises are the earliest teachings. They're the ones being composed right away there around 1500 BCE, and at least for a good 500, 600, 700 years, we're having different rishis primarily composing teachings that either fit within the hymn section or the ritual treatises section. Right? The early sections of the Vedas have a very this-worldly focus. Right? You could hyphenate that term, a this-worldly focus. In other words, the focus isn't otherworldly. Right? The idea of an afterlife, for example, is rarely ever discussed in the early sections of the Vedas, the hymns and the ritual treatises. The focus is always on this life, in this world, the life that we experience here and now. And the goal of the early sections of the Vedas is generally to find happiness, health, and prosperity in this life. And the way in which that can be found, according to the early sections of the Vedas, is by maintaining or restoring a sense of harmony between our world that we inhabit, that we know, and the gods and the goddesses above, right? And the idea is that these 2 kind of worlds are constantly intersecting. The gods and goddesses are also a part of this world, and they are making things happen for our better or for our worse. And our goal is to maintain harmony between us and the gods and goddesses so that we can experience health and happiness and prosperity in this life, right? So for example, many of the hymns will be praises to the deities, right? Deities will be attached to certain kind of geographic locations, right? There will be a river god or goddess. There will be a god or goddess of mountains, a god or goddess in charge of rain. And all of these things will produce within us, as the followers, a sense of desire to praise the deities for the blessings that they can provide and do provide to give us health and happiness and prosperity in this life. Of course, at times, things go wrong, right? Maybe the crops are not growing. And this is especially where you would make use of not only the hymns, but the ritual treatises, right? Because if your crops are not growing, something has been lost in that harmony between you and the gods and the goddesses. So what you would do is you would go to a priest, right? And you would say, my crops are not growing. And the priest, who is in charge of remembering all of these hymns and the ritual treatises that are being handed down generation to generation, will know which hymns to be sung in order to petition the gods and goddesses to assist your crops in growing, to restore that balance and that harmony between you and the deities, right? And then there will typically be a ritual that can be performed along with the singing of certain hymns in order to restore that harmony. Just as there could be a ritual used to praise the deities when the harmony is intact, right? Many of these rituals will include animal sacrifices, sacrifices of non-human animals, just like we might find again at a similar point in time in biblical Judaism. So there is a kind of sacrificial system at play within the ritual treatises when they are joined with the hymns, not only in praising but also petitioning the deities for that health and happiness in this life, a very this worldly focus. Now, when we get to some of the later hymns, those hymns that might be composed around 1900 BCE, a good 500-600 years into the development of Hinduism, we do start to see a little bit of a shift toward speculation about things maybe beyond this life, beyond a direct concern about the health and happiness within my life, right? That was really the only concern for several centuries. My child gets sick, I go to the priest, we find a ritual used to help heal a sick child, hymns that are sung to the right deities, and that's the way life worked for most Hindus at that time in history. But toward the later hymns, we get a little bit of a shift toward speculation. Generally, this speculation is not yet about our own individual existence. Right? We aren't yet asking questions like, why am I here? What is the purpose of life? Who am I? How do I relate to reality, right? What happens when I die? Those are very speculative questions about individual existence, and that's not really what we see even in the later hymns. The kind of speculation that we see is generally more about the creation of the universe, right? Why is anything here? How did all of this come to be? There is a hymn called the Creation Hymn that you could probably find very quickly with a quick Google search, where you basically have a rishi simply asking questions about creation, about how everything came into existence, about how everything exists. And there really aren't any answers, right? The hymn will suggest that in the beginning, perhaps there was only water, bottomlessly deep, as some translations say. And at one point, the hymn says that only the one in the highest heavens knows how all of this came to be. And then a couple lines later, it will say, or perhaps the one does not even know. So in other words, there's really no sense of an answer being given, but at least the questions are being asked. We're starting to see this shift toward more speculative questions about the universe itself, even if not about my own individual existence. There's another later hymn that comes a little bit later than the Creation Hymn that is often called the Hymn to the Supreme Person. And here we actually find some answers about how the universe came into existence. It's basically a creation narrative. Many of you might be familiar with Genesis 1, Genesis 2 as creation narratives for Judaism, for Christianity, even for Islam in a sense. But here we have in the Hymn to the Supreme Person a creation narrative. And what this hymn suggests is that there is this supreme person, this cosmic man, and all of his body parts will eventually, through a sacrifice, become the various elements of the universe, right? So the supreme person is sacrificed, right? The supreme person who has an infinite number of body parts is sacrificed, and all of these different body parts actually become the elements of the universe that we experience around us all the time, right? And you read through the Hymn to the Supreme Person, and it talks about how each body part is becoming a different aspect of our universe, right? The wind, for example, comes from the breath of the Supreme Person, right? The sun may come from his eyes, the earth from his feet, etc. So you have different body parts creating different elements of our universe. What's really interesting about the Hymn to the Supreme Person is about when it talks about the creation of human beings. And it actually says that different human beings, or at least different classes of human beings, or the word we'll use as castes of human beings, are created from different parts of the Supreme Person. So I'm going to read you that key passage from the Hymn of the Supreme Person. It says, "From his mouth came the priestly caste or class, the priests." We've already mentioned them as being kind of in charge of the remembrance of the hymns and the ritual treatises, the people you go to in order to maintain or restore harmony between you and the gods and goddesses. From his arms came the rulers, sometimes translated as warriors. The producers, sometimes translated as merchants, came from his legs, and from his feet came the servant class. What's interesting here is that in this early creation narrative coming from one of the later hymns, you have a creation of humanity already within what we will eventually refer to as the caste system of Hinduism, and largely India for much of history, because of Hinduism's dominance over India for much of history. So the caste system is seen as part of the initial creation of humanity in the sacrifice of the cosmic person. This is why when later reformers try to dismantle the caste system, to abolish the caste system, it's not always that easy, partly because the caste system is here written into the very fabric of creation. Right? That becomes a big obstacle for Hindus, even for those who want to get rid of caste discrimination and even perhaps the entire caste system. When something is seen as basic to the creation of the world, then it seems that that should maintain itself throughout all of history, and it doesn't seem like something that you should remove. We can even think about some of the arguments that contemporary Christians might use against something like homosexuality, right? You often have Christians on that side of the debate who will say that God created male and female, and that to them suggests the importance of the male-female relationship throughout all of history, right? So there you have something written into the creation narrative that seems to suggest something that is normative, something that should be maintained throughout all of history. Something similar is going on here within the Hymn of the Supreme Person, which does require then new interpretations, new ways of thinking about this creation narrative for those reformers who want to get beyond the caste system, right? So a very important hymn, the Hymn to the Supreme Person, in showing some of that shifting towards speculation, at least about the origins of the universe, even the origins of humanity, okay? Now we're going to see the really big shift, right? We've seen a little bit of speculation, but now we're going to see the really big shift towards speculation about individual existence. This is really what's going to happen as we move to the later two sections of the Vedas. It's a little bit of an oversimplification, but it will work for our purposes. In the Aranyakas, the compositions of the forest, generally what we find are those questions about individual existence starting to be asked. Who am I? What happens when I die? What is the purpose of my life? Right? How do I relate to everything else that exists in reality? These questions are being asked literally by people who are going out into the forest seeking for greater truth than what was offered in the early portions of the Vedas. It's not that the authors or composers of the Aranyakas are rejecting what's happening in the early Vedas. They still understand the gods and goddesses involved in our world and the desire for health and happiness in this life. What they're challenging is that that's all there is to be known. They simply want more truth, more knowledge. And of course, they believe that this knowledge is, in a sense, coming to them as they begin to ask these questions about individual existence. Right? And then finally, you turn to the Upanishads, sitting near the teacher. Right? This suggests that there's actually a teacher, someone who is teaching us, right, answers to those questions that are posed in the Aranyakas. We actually now have some answers being given to those speculative questions about individual existence, about how I relate to everything else, to reality itself, to the universe itself. What happens when I die? What is the purpose of my life? We're getting answers to those questions as we sit near the teachers in the Upanishads, right? Obviously, these later two sections are getting composed toward the end of that 900-year time span of the Vedas. Right, closer to 700, 600 BCE is where we see the rishis who are now composing the Aranyakas and the Upanishads, which will form the final sections of the Vedas. Interestingly, the Vedas throughout history have not been widely known by Hindus. Oftentimes, the higher castes, especially the priests, kind of maintained control of the Vedas, and they were not always taught to others of other castes, and they certainly weren't possessed by others of other castes. Even into the 20th century, 21st century, many Hindus will not own copies of the Vedas, right? Which is surprising because, again, as Shruti, these are technically the most authoritative teachings in all of Hinduism. They're like the Bible or the Quran, and most Christians and Muslims living in a part of the world where they can afford it will have a Bible or a Quran on their bookcases. This has not always been the case for Hindus. As we will see, there will be other teachings, other sacred texts that have been valued more highly in a day-to-day manner by Hindus than the Vedas, even though only the Vedas are Shruti and they maintain that technical authority over all other teachings. But again, they really represent the origin and the formation of Hinduism, and much of what happens in the Vedas will continue to this day, in the sense of that desire for happiness and health in this life and how we maintain that by our relationship with gods and goddesses who are involved in this life. And on the other hand, the desire for more truth about individual existence and some of those ideas that get promoted in the Upanishads, which we will talk about in the next video, remain central to most Hindus' understanding of their faith and what it means to seek the ultimate goal of life.